Welcome to Living from the Soul. This is your host, Sam Terode, and today I'm happy to be speaking with my longtime friend, Sarah Hempel Irani. Sarah and I both studied art at Hillsdale College in Michigan. She went on to earn a master's degree in medieval and Renaissance studies and to become a very accomplished sculptor. Sarah's sculptures have been included in many national shows and have won several awards, including one in a competition judged by Sister Wendy Beckett. Her most recent work is a 7-foot-tall bronze statue of fashion designer Claire McCardell for her town of Frederick, Maryland. I wanted to talk with Sarah about what goes into creating these monumental works, as well as the values they represent. I also wanted to ask her thoughts on the controversy about Confederate monuments, and to discuss the ways our political and religious opinions have shifted since we were in college long ago. Be sure to check out Sarah's website at hempelstudios.com and her Instagram, which is in the show notes, to see her work. Hey, Sarah.
Sam?
Well, how are you feeling?
Tired, but that's kind of my usual MO. I did a lot of homeschooling, and we went and played tennis, and I moved some things around in the studio. So it's like I kind of run around a lot, and then I finally get to work, and I'm like, oh, completely exhausted. But I'm here.
You just finished a huge sculpture, and you're already getting back to work on other things?
I'm sort of wrapping that up. So I'm not really starting a new thing per se, as much as cleaning up an old thing.
Yeah, okay. Well, I have just emerged from a couple weeks of existential angst.
Oh.
You know, it comes and goes in cycles.
Yes.
I was thinking, why must artists or creative people be tortured? Why can't we be normal?
Ooh, that's a good question. You know, I was thinking about this recently. I went to a talk, and the speaker kept referring to the artists and creative people and then the normies. The normies. and I think, it would be so nice to be a normie, because I feel like my brain is just buzzing all the time. There's always something going on. And then I complain that I've got too many things going on. And my husband, who is more or less a normie, he says, well, most of your stuff is self-inflicted. Nobody's making you do half of this stuff, right? Nobody's making you write these things or build sculptures. I mean, some people have hired me to do that, but he was like, a lot of this is your own self-imposed thing, that it's like, I'm working on this thing and it's torturing me. And it's like, nobody made you do that. But I don't know. I kind of feel like, I don't know if it's the muse or what it is, but she kind of hounds us.
I sometimes think, what would it be like to have a job where you just go in and do it and you don't worry about how it will be received? You're not worrying about the state of society while you're working on it. You just do your thing and leave.
I have no idea what that would feel like, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what it would feel like to exist in the world without, being troubled by all this. Mm. I feel like creative people are just really in tune with things, and the world is heavy. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to avoid that.
You managed to stay amazingly productive with the artwork, which I admire.
Thank you.
How do you, year after year, you just keep going at it and creating more and more?
I often ask myself the same question, because 3 months ago I was ready to be done. Like, I'm never making a sculpture again. This is the worst thing I could possibly do. I'm so tired. My studio's cold and it's like physically difficult. My back hurts. And I'm thinking, this is insane. There's no reason I should be doing this. And then, of course, I call one of my friends and I'm crying about it. And she says, Sarah, you're at the end of a hard project, the middle of a pandemic. It'll come back. And she was right. About 3 weeks later, I start, drawing new ideas. I feel like I have to. And it's not that the world is making me do it. It's like this internal tenacity. I imagine it to be like the muse who sort of just follows me around and is like, shoving me around. I mean, sometimes she's gentle and whispers things, but most of the time she's really pushy. I feel like I have an inner drive, and I've always been this way since I was a kid. I mean, I asked my dad to teach me how to type when I was in 3rd grade so I could write a screenplay. But it was after I'd heard about civil rights, which I didn't understand civil rights. And then in 3rd grade, they introduced Black History Month, and they taught us about Martin Luther King Jr. And didn't know what to do with that information. I mean, that's a horrifying thing to realize that exists in the world when you're a kid. And so I thought, well, I'm going to make a movie about it. So I was like, Dad, you have to teach me how to type. I'm 9. Like, I don't even know how to type, you know? And so I somehow managed to get all the neighborhood kids to buy in on this. And, you know, I passed out scripts, and I got the neighborhood kid who was in the high school band. Like, he did live music for us
Wow.
because I didn't want canned music in my film. But it was like a natural response to receiving something horrible about the world. And I had to do something about it.
Did you actually finish it?
They did, and I will send you a link. It's on YouTube. I mean, it's all grainy because it was on one of those 1984, you know, video cameras that weighed like as much as a small dog. My brother asked me, what would possess a 9-year-old to like decide that she wants to make a film? And I have no idea. It's how I respond to things, I guess. And I don't make films now or anything, but it was a creative response to receiving something difficult about the world.
Well, tell me about the huge sculpture you just finished, Claire McCardell. First of all, who is that?
So Claire McCardell was a fashion designer. And I think fashion design is something that people think is kind of irrelevant. But she totally transformed the way, especially women dress. So she was born in the turn of the century in Frederick, Maryland, which is where I am now. And she went to college for 2 years here in Frederick, and then she went off to New York and to Paris. And she essentially brought the locus of fashion from Paris to New York City and gave us the American look. And she gave us separate. It used to be that women would wear a dress. You had to wear, you know, like a girdle or a corset, and you had to have somebody zip you in. And so all the clothes that she designed were things that women could put on themselves and they could move around in. They had generous sleeve openings so that women could move their arms, and they all had pockets. So sometimes I quip that I made a monument to pockets, you know, because everyone's so excited about pockets. And she put the hoodie in fashion. She saw that in Europe, the monasteries, all the monks wore hoods, and they were really useful.
Wow.
So I have a hoodie on today, in fact. So she gave us the hoodie and leggings, sportswear for women, comfortable shoes. She gave us the ballet flat, or she essentially took it from the dance studio and made it so that you could wear it, you know, outside the dance studio. And during World War II, there was a lot of rationing of things, even like metal for zippers and such, and leather because of the war effort. And even certain fabrics were rationed. So she got really creative and used like denim, you know, like denim dresses she would make, where before that denim was like a working man's fabric. She used a lot of tweed and different fabrics that were not commonly used for women.
I had no idea that one person was so influential in American clothing.
Neither had I. I had no idea who she was, but she was on the cover of Time. Truman gave her an award. And yeah, she was enormously famous during her time. Everybody wanted to be seen in Claire McCardell. And you could see if you watch The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel.
Yeah.
Mrs. Maisel wears a lot of Claire McCardell garments when she's expressing herself as a young, independent woman.
Wow.
So coming to Frederick, so it used to be that in the Victorian era, they had these art clubs all over the United States. And it was mostly women, and they would get together and learn about art. And many of them were either artists or patrons, and they would do some art-related philanthropy in the community. So it turns out that Frederick, Maryland has one of the oldest still operating art clubs from the Victorian era. And so for their 120th celebration, they thought, well, let's do something to celebrate women in art in Frederick. So the Historic Society did a presentation on Claire McCardell, and they thought, that's it. We're going to do a sculpture, and I think initially it was a plaque for Claire McCardell, so everyone will know she's from Frederick. It went from a plaque to a little sculpture to a slightly larger sculpture to a 7.5-foot bronze.
Wow.
It's just a bunch of women who were dreaming big and thought, let's do something really big. So one of the women suggested me, because I'm a woman and I live here in Frederick, and they wanted this to be a woman-driven project. So they asked me if I would do this project. And at the beginning, they had no budget. they believed in me and I believed in them. And I made several different 18-inch models. And when we decided on one that everyone was really excited about, I had it cast. And we did all these amazing fundraisers, and they raised a large sum of money in only a few months because everyone was so excited when they heard about Claire McCardell.
Wow.
So it's a very, very well supported endeavor, and the community, people all over the community came and raised money for this. So
the city didn't pay for it.
no, and in fact, a lot of public sculptures, a lot of people think, I don't want my taxpayers' dollars paying for that. A lot of these sort of projects are privately funded, and then they're gifted to the city. So this will be gifted to the city of Frederick, and then it will be cared for. There's going to be a trust that is used to care for it in perpetuity.
Well, that's complicated.
It is, but caring for a bronze, they're actually pretty low maintenance. You dust them a few times, but if there's going to be landscaping and lighting and such.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Someone's going to have to plant flowers around it and take care of them every year.
Yeah, and the city owns the property that it'll be on. So what this has meant that I had to make this 18-inch model into 7.5 feet.
Wow.
So I have spent the entire pandemic doing that, which has been really, really challenging.
How long did it take, start to finish, on the large sculpture?
So I first did an intermediate model. So I did a 4-foot model, and then I had an enlarging studio scale it up to the full scale. So they had to, build a metal armature and cover it in foam and then skim it with clay. And then I spent, I'm going to say, about 6 months once that came to the studio, getting it just right.
Wow.
So it's been an incredibly productive year and a very tiring year. So we're homeschooling in the morning, and then I have lunch, and then I would come to the studio. And fortunately for me, like, everything was canceled, so I didn't really have a lot of other things to do, which was very helpful in keeping productive.
Yeah.
It burned me out a lot. I was going to say a little bit. No, it burned me out pretty heavily. There were parts of it that, when I get into the zone, when I get into that flow state, and I'm just working with the tools, and I've got my music or my podcast going, and I'm just sort of at cruising altitude with the clay. Like, it feels so right and so good that it's like it blinds me from all the horrible stuff. Because making a big sculpture, I mean, 90% of it is just difficult. But then there's that magic in that flow state that is so worth it, that I'll stand on a ladder half the day after day in the winter time, to get there. It's like, oh, it's so good.
Well, it's great. Well, one of the exciting things with your sculpture is that we need more sculptures of women in this country. Do you know the statistics of public sculptures? Like, how many are men versus women?
I don't know exact statistics off the top of my head, but I will tell you some observations that I've made. So I live about an hour north of Washington, D.C., and especially when I first moved here, I spent a lot of time in Washington. And I was appalled at the lack of women's sculptures. And when I say that, I mean actual historic women, like, not because there's a bunch of nude women, on the pedestals with the man on a horse, this, what I'm talking about, or, justice, this sort of thing. These sort of abstractions of women. Yeah. There's plenty of those. But actual women, I can count on my hand. There's Eleanor Roosevelt at the FDR Memorial. There's Queen Martha of Norway, which is at the Norwegian Embassy. So it's technically kind of like not even America, but you could see it from the road, There's Joan of Arc. There's a couple of Virgin Marys. There's, I'm going to get her name wrong, I'm going to say Bertha McLeod or Bertha. I haven't seen it in person. That might be it. I mean, maybe there's a few others. There's really just a handful.
Yeah.
Even the sculptures that celebrate women, like the Vietnam Memorial, or what is it, the Women in the Vietnam War Memorial, which is nearby the Vietnam Wall. They're kind of generalizations of actual women. So it's like celebrating the nurses who were involved in the war, but it's not particular nurses. Yeah. So they're grim. I mean, if you consider all of the statuary that's in Washington, D.C., I mean, there's a lot. Now, in the Capitol, they're adding more women, in the rotunda. So they're doing that. But in New York City, so this has been in the news recently. In Central Park, there's 23 sculptures of men and no women until 2020. They just erected one last year. In 2021, This is our first sculpture of an actual woman in Central Park. And of course, there's sculptures of women throughout the United States, in different towns and such. Richmond, Virginia just got a big sculpture of Maggie Walker. And that's become a really cool site for people to gather because it's celebrating an African American businesswoman. So especially with all that's going on in Richmond, that's been a really cool addition to their landscape.
So we need more. We need to keep you busy.
Yes.
Creating these sculptures of women. So more cities need to get some people to raise the funds.
Right. When it's somebody that we all can get excited about, like Claire McCardell, nobody's like, boo, pockets, boo, comfortable clothes. Like nobody really hates her, to my knowledge. I mean, nobody's like, we should go back to wearing uncomfortable corsets and not have any pockets. So I think that enthusiasm is there when it's somebody that people sort of universally want to celebrate. So it was an easy sell in that way, and for Frederick. Now, Frederick is the home of Francis Scott Key, so he's like our famous person. So there's plenty of things about him. And I think most towns have a handful of famous people they want to celebrate.
Well, I bet there are a lot more statues of Confederates in the Capitol than women.
I don't know the exact numbers, but I guarantee you're right. Yes. And that's really sad.
I think each state got to send 2 sculptures. Is that right, to be in the Capitol?
Yes. Yeah, it's 2 sculptures. And so if you decide to take one out, you can put a different one. You can swap them out. So the state gets 2 choices. And so they have to pick 2 people to sort of represent their state.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of swapping out in recent years. And it's cool to go there. And I haven't been there in some time because of the pandemic, but it's cool to see what the states have chosen or who the states have chosen to send. And you could see, over the years, the styles have changed. And I mean, they have to be figurative and kind of not take up an enormous amount of space because there's a lot of them. There's 100 of them.
And some of the southern states got away with sending a bunch of Confederate soldiers and generals to the Capitol.
Oh, yes. I don't know off the top of my head who exactly is there. But there are some people that maybe you and I would not want to invite to a dinner party who are represented at the Capitol.
So what do you think of this argument that, well, public sculptures represent our history, so we need to keep all these Confederate monuments because that's history?
Oh my goodness, I do have very strong opinions on this, and folks are usually surprised, being a sculptor, that I'm very much in favor of taking them down. I see the role of, especially public monuments that are in public squares, as this is not just an image of that person. It's not like a facsimile of, George or Rob. It's not him. It's what that person represents. And so it's a celebration of those values that person represents. For example, the Lincoln Memorial. It's not a picture of Abe, who's our pal, like a guy named Abe, right? It is Abraham Lincoln who represents the unification of the United States after the Civil War. He represents emancipation. He represents unity and freedom, that sort of thing. So that's really what that sculpture is about. So when we have sculptures of Robert E. Lee, for example, down in Richmond, what is this sculpture saying? It's really, really high up. He's on a horse, which makes us think of the tradition of Marcus Aurelius, in Rome, of these emperors. This is the thread of history that we're passing on. And so it's elevating this person who really represents. What does he represent? I think he represents the South wanting to secede, the South wanting to conserve slavery. He represents oppression. I mean, he's way up there, looking down upon us. He's not a historic artifact. Like we conserve battlefields as historic places where we can wrestle with those difficult pieces of history. We conserve homes of Roger Brooke Tawney, who is a notorious Supreme Court justice from Frederick, Maryland. I bring up Frederick because this is where I am. Who he gave us the Dred Scott decision, and his home is preserved as a place where we can learn.
I don't think we need that. I think we should just get rid of that home, bulldoze it.
Right. No,
we don't need to. We don't need to bring school kids there and say, "Here's the man who handed down the Dred Scott decision, the worst Supreme Court decision in history, lived here."
Well, up until like 2 years ago, he had a sculpture in front of our city hall.
Oh, wow.
And people would go vandalize it with red paint. And I'm thinking, right on, like that needs to come down off the city hall. That does not represent who we are in Frederick. So I would say keep the historic sites and let's learn from those places. Like, we send school kids to Off Switch, or German students go there and learn about that horrifying part of their history.
Right.
But they don't have sculptures of Nazis around.
Yeah.
That's unthinkable. It's unthinkable.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we're taking these sculptures down, we're not removing history. We're removing the celebration of these ideals, which is a different thing. We're not destroying the memory. We're not destroying the knowledge or the artifacts or that sort of thing.
Yeah. And most of these Confederate sculptures were erected beginning in the 20s and especially picking up basically as the Ku Klux Klan grew in power, number of these sculptures increased.
Right. So one could argue that all public art is propaganda. And so it functions very much as propaganda. People are fighting for civil rights, and it's the people who don't want that to happen are sending out this propaganda.
Yeah.
No, I think we can have good propaganda also. And I think when we erect public art that celebrates unity and creativity and peacemaking, that is sending a very different message. So propaganda doesn't always have to be bad, but that's what it is.
Yeah.
We recently went to Richmond, in fact. I wanted to see the monuments. I hadn't been there in 20 years. And to me, and so they took down the one of his name escapes me. So some of the land is the city land and some of the land is the state land. So because this is the capital, so it has to go through different bureaucratic channels in order to remove them, unless they want to forcibly remove them. However, General E. Lee on that horse, that's pretty difficult to physically remove. It's really high up there. But what they've done to it, in my opinion, so people have come and gathered around this sculpture and they've spray painted it.
Yeah.
And they've really turned it into art. Like they've taken this thing that is a symbol of the South wanting to own human beings. And I think it's easy for us to forget that that's the reality of our history, is they wanted to fight for the right for some people to own other people. And it's horrifying. The citizens have come and they've painted it and they've changed it and they've really turned it into a work of art, in my opinion. And there's some Langston Hughes poetry spray painted around the street, and it's kind of blocked off right now, so you can't access the sculpture. But it was really a cool thing to see, and I hope they take it down and leave the pedestal there just as it is.
Yeah. Here in Nashville, in the Tennessee state capitol, we have a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK and a Confederate general. It was put up in the late 1970s by some white supremacist group. They've been trying for so long to get this bust out of the Capitol, and every time a group votes to remove it, another group votes to keep it in, and just the Republicans are fighting tooth and nail to keep this bust there. It's really incredible and disappointing.
That's pretty horrifying. But it also says a lot about the power of this kind of art. Like, what does it mean to people?
Yeah.
Why, if it didn't matter at all, nobody would care. Somebody could just put it in a closet. Nobody would care. But it carries with it a lot of symbolism and power. Even like if you can imagine somebody attacking the Statue of Liberty and it's empty, there's nobody there, nobody is hurt. But it's as though somebody were attacking liberty itself. They're not just defacing a sculpture. It carries with it so much meaning. And that's why I think we need to be careful about what we put up and how we put it up. And it's a dangerous line to walk as far as like community involvement and then art by committee, which could be really terrible. But you also want some sense of community buy-in. But you don't want to exclude people either, because there are a lot of people who are disenfranchised who don't get to participate in decision making for what goes up in their city. And so how can communities better reach out to not just the main economic drivers in a city who tend to be the privileged people? I don't have a good answer to that necessarily, other than paying attention and listening and engaging with different communities in your city.
There is a great sculpture that just went up in Nashville within the past few years in honor of women's suffrage. And there are 3 suffragettes carrying banners.
Oh,
Tennessee has some interesting history with that. I think that Tennessee was the state that pushed the amendment into law allowing women to vote. I think it passed the Tennessee House by 1 vote, and the guy who he changed his vote at the last minute because his mom wrote him and shamed him into voting for women's suffrage. So he changed his vote, and then he was chased out. They attempted to lynch him. He was chased out of the Capitol after he voted. But that's how America got women's suffrage.
that is awesome. I have to look up this sculpture because I am wondering who did it.
Oh, it could be Alan LaQuire, he's the most famous sculptor in town. I see it's on his website.
Oh, is it? Okay. So here's a funny story about him. When I was in my last year of school, what do you do when you leave college? Like when you're in the arts, like what are you going to do? What are you going to be when you grow up? And somebody gave me the advice to find a sculptor whose work I liked and then see if they taught anywhere and go to graduate school. So I went on this hunt to find people who were doing these sort of big figurative sculptures. And I found Alan LaQuire. And I was in conversation with him about working as an assistant. And he was working on there's like a musica,
Yeah.
like a traffic circle or a fountain or something. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
So he was doing this at the time. And I was like, oh, I'm going to move to Nashville. And I'm going to work for this sculptor and it'll be amazing. And instead, I ended up meeting Jay, who I went to work for in Washington. So I ended up working as an assistant to a different sculptor, which totally changed the course of my life. And I met Alan at sort of sculpture conference in Chattanooga, maybe. Anyhow, so I could be living in Nashville now. Who knows?
And that was Jay Carpenter, the sculptor in Washington, D.C.
Yes, J. Hall Carpenter. He lives outside of Washington and worked at the National Cathedral for 25 years.
And he was under, is it Thomas Hart? What's the name of the sculptor at the Washington Cathedral?
Frederick Hart.
Frederick Hart. Yeah, he's amazing.
Yes, yeah, he did the facade at the National Cathedral, and Jay was his assistant. And and then so on and so forth. So it was sort of felt Renaissance-y to pass the baton on and on.
Yeah, you're in the guild.
Right. Sort of. I have not yet been initiated into the National Sculpture Society, though. So my goal was to be the youngest person to be in the National Sculpture Society, which turned out to be Jay at the time. So I don't know who it is now. And I thought, okay, by the time I'm 30, and then 30 passed. And I'm like, by the time I'm 40, and 40 has passed. So I don't know, maybe they'll let me in one day.
Is it a bunch of old folks or what? A bunch of old fogies?
Stop paying attention after I didn't meet my goal. So I don't know.
They don't deserve you.
Oh, well.
What do you think drew you to sculpture? Because we were art students together at Hillsdale College, and in every class there would be a couple people who really got into sculpture. I was not one of those. I took the sculpture class and stuck to my paper and canvas. What was it with the sculpture?
The thing about sculpture, so when we arrived at college, and perhaps you had the same experiences, I had been like one of the best artists in my high school. And then I went to college thinking like I was pretty good. And then I was in class with all the other people who had been the best students at their respective high schools. And so all, like the bar really went up.
Yeah.
So I felt really challenged. And I mean, after like my ego took a big beating, I was like, okay, I can rise to this occasion. And then, the registrar just put me in Sculpture 1 my freshman year. And it was probably the hardest thing I've ever done up until that point. And I had thought that I was pretty good at art, but this was so difficult and I didn't want it to best me. And so I just worked so hard on it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I was going to do it. I was going to get it right and do a really good job. And then, of course, our professor, Tony Fredakis, he felt to me like a sage, like a wise sage that you would find at a mountaintop, and I just wanted to like glean his wisdom. That sculpture that I made in first year ended up winning like the regional college art show and some other things. And I remember Tony commenting on my drawings. He said, "Oh, you're obviously a sculptor by the way you draw."
Huh.
What in the world does that mean? And I've come to realize that it means that the way that my brain takes in the world, I tend to take in objects, and I'm very interested in form, whereas I think painters tend to be interested in atmosphere and the whole environment. So whenever I had drawn, I would always like isolate an object. I didn't care about the space around it. It was just all about that object and really making it very round. And even like I like to sew, and it comes naturally, but like I can take a flat fabric and figure out how to manipulate it in such a way that it can move around a round body. Like my brain just sort of conceptualizes space in that way. So it felt like, okay, well this seems to fit with how I think and how I am. And then so when I arrived in school, I was going to do biology and art because I wanted to do like medical textbooks because I love science and I love like, those sort of fastidious drawings.
Yeah.
And so I took Latin because I thought that would help me out with science. And I just got totally swept up in the classics, the whole thing of it. So I got really into Greek and Roman language and literature, and then art, of course. And so like the best figurative art that we have in the West comes out of that tradition. And I just like felt like I was just swimming in it and I loved it. And then I wanted to make big sculptures like Tony did, for public consumption. And part of that stems from growing up in a rural place where I didn't really have any access to cultural institutions or art, or like I had a huge drive to make art, but I didn't really have access to it.
Yeah.
For most people, the only art that they have is public art, that's in the cities and parks or at the library or at a church. So that's really the only time we have access to it. It sort of belongs to everybody, which there's something like beautiful and democratic about that I just love. So I often ask myself, why in the world would my calling be to this thing that's really physically demanding and huge? Like I'm 5'2", and he quipped one time that I was 3/4 life size. It's like physically really demanding, like more demanding than what my body is really up for.
I have to say for the record, so we had this great sculpture professor at our college, Tony Fredakis, and his father, Evangelos Fredakis, made a statue that's in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and it's one of the founding fathers holding up the Declaration of Independence over his head. And they completely ripped that off for the Hamilton logo, for the Hamilton play.
The Hamilton.
Yeah, the Fredakis family needs to be getting all the royalties from that logo.
Yes, that's awesome.
Tony was a great professor. I just did not get bit by the sculpture bug. I think it was just too messy and frustrating and 3D for me.
Yes. Messy, frustrating. It's very physical.
Yeah.
And there is something I do like about the physicality of it, honestly. Like, even though I feel like I'm like always tired and would rather just think about things, but there's something about like, especially when it's really large and like pulling on the clay and just like putting my whole body into it. I don't know. I kind of really enjoy that.
It's very mathematical too. You have to, when you're doing a figurative sculpture, you have to measure your subject, make sure your sculpture is the exact same size down to the millimeter. Or like you said, you did a smaller model, then you expand that to a 3/4 size model, then the full size. And it's a lot of proportion and mathematics involved in that.
Yes, it is a lot of math. It's not complicated math, but there's a lot of it. Sometimes I find that frustrating, but I think artists tend to be very right-brained, and people tend to think of artists as like existing in that sort of creative space. But I'm very both-brained. I really enjoy solving problems in that way and building things and trying to think through like all the steps that it would take to build something. So it sort of allows me to go back and forth between the sides of my brain.
And to go back to something you said earlier about how when you get to college, everyone was the best artist in their high school, but you were still one of the best in your class. You definitely made a big impression on me. I was 2 years older than you, I think. I definitely recognized you as one of the best.
Did you? Thank you. Wow, Sam, you're gonna make me blush. No, I remember you and Aaron, especially when you did your self-portraits. I thought, oh my gosh, they're really good. Like,
and for us, it was Tessa Higbee and Amy Smallwood in the class above us. We looked up to them as the best artists at the school. So
Right, right. No, I remember there were some folks who came in younger than me who were really good, and I thought, oh no, like here's the competition, and then I had to befriend them, of course, and but they're still like tremendous artists. We had a lot of really good artists come through this small place.
And sculptors in particular, like how many sculptors in the country are there? Not very many, I would think, compared to painters or drawers.
That's true. When I went to the National Sculpture Society sponsors the young artist figure modeling competition. I went in like 2002 or 3, I can't remember. And so of all the people who applied for this, they chose 10 people to come to the Lime Academy in Connecticut and have a competition. So we were there for a week and we had a model for 6 hours a day. And then whoever made the best sculpture won. And 4 of us were from Hillsdale.
Wow.
And they're thinking, where is this place? Like, why are there so many people? and the person who won was Carolyn, who went to Hillsdale. And we were all helping each other too. And the other contestants, they thought it was very strange that we weren't like trying to sabotage, we were kind of helping each other out. And Tony felt like a proud father, his students had all gone to this kind of prestigious competition.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know we both have a lot of mixed feelings about Hillsdale College where we went. They're very big on the Western tradition and heritage. And so that's, I think, why they hired a classical sculpture professor who then influenced all these students who became great sculptors. So that's amazing. But on the other hand, the school is so focused on the Western tradition to the exclusion of other cultures.
Yes. And I wrestle with this a lot. I am fortunate to have lived in Japan as a child. And so I grew up with this idea that America is not, in fact, the center of the universe, that there are other people living beautiful lives and expressing their humanity and so on and so forth. So I had that understanding. And yet I don't know much about art that's outside of the Western canon, and that's largely my education. I think, though, in general, I mean, most Americans don't know much about art history, let alone art that's outside of the Western canon. So, on one hand, I'm so grateful that I learned from this tradition, because this is, I mean, my tradition. I'm a person of the West, of European heritage. And so I'm grateful to have learned this tradition. And yet I do feel like it was deeply limited, and I'm not entirely sure how to integrate that, like in the place that I am now, other than to be a sculptor who is putting women and underrepresented communities on pedestals.
Right. Well, that's a great contribution right there.
I hope so. Though I think that part of the reason there's not as much access, to arts education, and it takes a certain amount of risk to be an artist. And if you grow up in a marginalized community and don't have the means necessarily, not that artists necessarily have means, but I think that there's a tremendous amount of risk, financial risk. And I know that growing up, even though, I grew up in a rural area and my parents don't have a lot of money, my parents have a lot of stability. And like if it didn't work out, if I moved to Washington and I was a starving artist and it didn't work out, like I always had a backup plan. And I think folks who are interested in art who maybe don't have that level of support, I think it's very difficult to grow up and to be an artist. I'm over 40 now and I feel like I'm just getting started.
Wow.
And without the support that I've had in my life from, my husband and our families, I couldn't have sustained this, because it's too much feast and famine. It's too much, when you have a big job, things are great. And then there's a lot of times where there's not enough to pay the studio rent. I would like to imagine a way to pass on the skills to folks who may not have access otherwise. How do we improve access? Obviously, the public schools, arts funding is always the first thing to go.
Yeah.
So how do we do this? How do we do this to make art more equitable, reach more people? Yeah, it was a tremendous poverty coming out of Hillsdale. Like I felt like I had a great foundation. Then when I went to graduate school, I realized that I had never read a book by a Black author.
Yeah.
That's really impoverishing. like a whole perspective that I missed out on in my education.
Yeah.
I didn't know very much about contemporary art. And yet I'm so grateful that I went there. Like the friendships that I've forged. And, I mean, we've been out of school for how long? An embarrassingly long amount of time. And, we're still friends. And I think that's so remarkable and beautiful.
Yeah. Definitely the people and the relationships were the most important part. The school has unfortunately become even more embarrassing with time as the president endorsed Trump twice and all that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have found an online support group for other liberal alumni of the college.
It's amazing to me how, I don't want to say similar, but like the way a person's thoughts have evolved
Yeah.
over time. It's amazing to make those connections and see people following a similar path.
Yeah.
And some of it is, I think, people who took it very, very seriously. I think you and I are both people who read this literature, these great books and these great ideas, and took that really seriously and tried to apply it to life and kind of picked it apart, found the flaws in it. And I think artists are people who really pay attention, or sort of watching carefully. And I can speak for myself that I saw and heard stories of real people that a lot of the things that we learned didn't work. Didn't work in the real world. It wasn't true for a lot of people. And we were taught so much to pursue the truth. That's their big thing, right? At Hillsdale is pursue the truth, the good, the true, and the beautiful. And when I'm in real life and I'm encountering deeply beautiful people who have perspectives that are really, really different, what do you do with that cognitive dissonance? Right? Am I going to believe this person and their real experience? Yes, I am going to believe that. I'm going to believe their stories. But it starts to create fissures in one's philosophies and leaves it open for, I think, sitting with that sense of mystery and a sense of I do not understand the totality of how things are. So much of what we were presented with is packaged tonight. This is how the world is, and these are the ideals. And then you go out, and the world is a mess, and people are complicated, and things don't follow those rules.
Yeah.
So it's disorienting.
Yeah. Well, early in your sculpting career after college, you did several sculptures for churches. I think your religious beliefs have changed some since then. How does that work for you? You're changing beliefs and creating art with religious themes.
Well, I still call myself a Christian, and I very much love and believe in Jesus, and it's expressed in a very different way. And I think part of it is that I took those things very seriously, and things started to evolve the more, I spent time reading the Gospels, and I'm thinking, this Jesus fellow, he was pretty radical, and he encouraged people to love people that we're not supposed to love.
Yeah.
So now, my approach to making religious sculpture, which I still love doing, is not to push a particular kind of dogma, but hopefully is to help people kind of sit with this sense of divine mystery. What is God really telling us? What is there a way to think spiritually, shall we say, that's true and not dogmatic? I don't know if that makes any sense. So a few years ago, I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and I went through chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery, and all of this. And it was pretty grueling. And when you go through something really, really hard like that, it makes you question, what is God doing? Where is God in this?
Yeah.
I followed the rules, I did the right things. I've lived a good life and all of that. What's God doing here? And I don't buy this God's trying to teach us a lesson or this sort of quippy things. But I found that during that time, I couldn't do anything for other people. And yet people were still so loving and kind to me. And people just kept showing up and caring for me. And I feel that's that was it. I didn't find any comfort in reading scriptures. I didn't find any comfort from dogma. I didn't find any comfort from, a lot of this religious stuff. But what I found was that people were loving me unconditionally. They couldn't get anything from me. They just cared about me. And I think that's the heart of what Jesus is teaching, is this sense of unconditional love. And I found this presence of the divine in that. And so I guess maybe my official dogma maybe looks different, but that sense of unconditional love as healing. And it wasn't like one person, it was a lot of people, doing tiny things. And so it was like, one person just sent a card. Well, that wasn't a huge act from them. But then when another person did and another person did, it was like these small acts that built up into this like presence of God.
Yeah.
And I hope that I can make sculptures of religious people, of religious ideas that catch that essence of what it is to be close to the divine. And it's that unconditional love. And I think we provide that for one another.
That's great. I know for me, I tend to get more hung up on the dogmas and the theology, such as when I think about the Virgin Mary, I immediately go to, well, this doctrine was created because there was an idea in the early church that sex was bad. Therefore, Jesus's mother had to be a virgin. And there were all these other virgin births, such as Pythagoras. Well, he was considered a half divine being, and he had a virgin birth. And there's quite a bit of that going on in that whole region at that time. So I tend to get upset at the idea of like the doctrine of the Virgin Mary. But I think you look at that symbol in a whole different way and create a different sort of meaning with it.
Yeah, I tend to think of the Virgin Mary as an archetype, and maybe she was a real person, but I think her story is like this deeply human story. So my daughter and I were homeschooling, and so we've been learning about the Norse myths and the Greek myths and the Egyptian myths, and there are these recurring themes. And you've read Joseph Campbell,
Yeah.
and there's these recurring themes over and over again in human history around the globe. And so I feel like there's something deeply human and deeply true about those stories. So whether they're literal, like I don't think is as important as what the story means. And I'm sure that somebody on the internet is calling me a heretic for that. But the historicity of Mary's experience isn't as important as the story. There's truth in that story. And the truth is that a miracle happened and the divine lived with us. And I think there's something deeply human about seeking God, or I don't know, everybody's seeking something, whether it's the universe or whether it's energy or whether it's God or many gods or what. We're all yearning for that something. And so for a story to have the divine coming to us is deeply, deeply human, and it's redemptive. So Mary also represents the sort of femaleness that's with God.
Uh-huh.
And my daughter, she's very angry that Mary's not part of the Trinity. And she argues with me, and I'm like, listen, I did not make this up. And I said,
She has
so
a
if you
good
can
point.
imagine well, to her, the Trinity is family. And family has to, we can't leave the mom out. Like, that's a terrible family.
Right.
And yet, so I say, well, if you think about the Trinity as being the divine part and Mary as being the mother, then they're next to each other rather than the same. So she's not totally buying it. But having this sense of mother, I think has been important for me.
Yeah.
Especially like when I became a mother, and I became a mother through adoption, which is just jump right in with 2 feet, with a toddler. And again, like these points of crisis in my life, I did not find any comfort in theology. I didn't find any comfort in the scriptures. I didn't find any comfort in sort of these pithy sayings, God's in control, or everything happens for a reason, this sort of nonsense. But what I did find comfort in is these beautiful images of Mary that felt like a place where I could sort of curl up. It's a mother that's beyond like our earthly moms. So I am grateful to have an earthly mom that I can call up and such. So it sort of takes that place that, especially as a woman, like that feminine, divine feminine connection.
Yeah.
So she's a mom, but she's also a mom that's filled with grief in some of the iterations. And I think she is a nice place to bring grief as someone who understands. I don't know if everyone finds comfort in sculptures like I do, but I mean, clearly churches put them up, so people must. But there's a certain comfort in feeling sort of understood. Here is an archetype. Here's the mother of God who understands your sorrow. And I think there's something really beautiful about that and very connecting. So if I can offer that to people in a sculpture, like that feels like an honor to me, to help people carry their difficult things.
That's great. I think these figures are symbols for all of us. Like you mentioned, Jesus being the incarnation of the divine. I think we're all as much an incarnation of the divine as Jesus was, but it's hidden from us, or it's too great a truth to look at in the face, so we project it all onto Jesus and say, oh, he was the only incarnation of God. And you just referred to Mary as the Mother of God, which is one of her traditional titles. And in a sense, all mothers are, in a sense, just like Mary, but she becomes a symbol that we project all divinity onto.
Hmm. That's a way to phrase it that I haven't thought in such clear terms. And I always appreciate that about you. I feel like you take ideas that are really difficult and clarify them.
Thanks.
So I think that, we talk about the image of God, that the Imago Dei, that we all carry the Imago Dei.
Yeah.
And I saw at a church billboard the other day, which I don't usually pay attention to these things, but it said that racism defiles the Imago Dei, the image of God. It was just really hung on to me, that the way that we view other people, and if we can somehow hold on to, here's a person that's been created by God and loved by God, then I think the way that we behave towards one another becomes different. And I have not arrived. I'm still irritable with my family sometimes, and I give people, instead of making lewd gestures, I just kind of give a thumbs down to when I'm driving or whatever. I'm I'm just as cranky as anyone else. But I just try to really go back to seeing people as created by God, as the artwork of God that softens it a little bit. I'm very interested in people, obviously. Like, I make figurative sculpture, and I'm not just interested in the figure as like a dynamic pose. I tend not to emphasize that, but I'm very interested in sort of the inner drama of people. So when I'm out and about and I'm seeing people, I like to consider their inner drama and their countenance and how they look and how they carry themselves and what that conveys. After my cancer diagnosis, I remember for weeks I just couldn't stop crying. I was so scared. And I would, have to do normal mom stuff. And I would go to the grocery store and I'm just like trying not to cry, and being kind of short with people, and forgetful. And then I would come to the car and I would cry. And I realized that when people are nasty to one another, I don't know what they're carrying. Did they just get a cancer diagnosis too?
Right.
And anyhow, so it's helped me to be more compassionate, even in the past 4 years, especially online. People have been really nasty to one another, and I have not been very generous either with people, with politically. And anyhow, but I try to go back to that. Like, this is a person. This person's been created in the image of God. I don't know what this person's carrying or what wounds they're bringing to this. Trying. Total work in progress.
Yeah, it's a tough one when our president, sort of the national symbol, is normalizing and legitimatizing abusive language. Then it certainly it spreads through the culture. And even with Trump gone, we see all these politicians trying to carry on his legacy of just abusive and awful language.
Yeah, no, it's been horrifying. And it's been horrifying to see people who otherwise are like beautiful, like wonderful human beings that I love and care about, using some of this kind of language.
Yeah.
And sort of parroting it back. But it's touching something. Like, what is it that it's touching inside of them that they're nodding their head with it and saying, yeah, that's right. And repeating it, and I don't want to say that any of us are immune to that sort of thing. Like, we all do that, but it's like beautiful people that I love. And I just have to like really hold on to, rather than thinking of them as a them or like a group, like trying to think of individuals that I know and that I deeply love.
Yeah.
And there's something about that language that is touching them in a wounded place or something. I am, I'm still like baffled by it.
Yeah. That reminds me that a few weeks ago, so after a couple months of being banned from Twitter and totally silent, Trump emerged with this major statement that he issued to the press. and it was a slur against the Chinese involving the coronavirus. Uh,
Uh,
and that sort of thing is cheered on by so many people is very disheartening.
It is disheartening. And I mean, as a student of history, though, like this is like what humans do, right? Like, let's blame it on these people.
Yeah.
What about these? There's always somebody to blame. And if we could just get rid of those people, then we'll be okay. But it comes from a place of fear and, wanting to place blame rather than honestly solving problems or owning our own responsibility in things. Or, it's really lazy thinking.
Yeah.
It's easy to blame somebody, and I don't know why it even makes us feel better. I mean, even in regular life, like when we, who spilled this coffee? Well, if you found the culprit, like, would it make the coffee unspilled? Would it help you clean it up? It doesn't really, it's not helpful in any way, but it feels satisfying to blame other people. And there's something about our human nature that wants to like take responsibility and heave it off of ourselves onto those people.
Mm-hmm. Well.
So maybe I should do some sculptures of those people. And
So what is next for you? Do you just wait now for the next commission to come in, or are you going to scheme up a new sculpture idea?
That is a good question. So we're installing this sculpture in October. So it's out of my studio. It's at the Bronze Foundry. But I still have to work on the pedestal, and there's landscape design that they have a landscape designer and all of that. But I'm still kind of a project managing, not the landscape designer per se, but the pedestal and the transportation of all these things and the installation crew. So I still have some work to do. But what's next? So one thing that's next is I'm working with a design team to develop a new website. And on my new website will be some inspiring things and some e-courses and some ebooks that are in the works. So, don't hold your breath just yet. We're going to put them out as I am able to produce them.
Is this sculpture related teaching or?
Yes, no, some of it will be sculpture related. Some of it will be about how to commission a sculpture, for one. I wrote a blog post years ago on how to commission a sculpture, and it's like one of the top Google hits because I think people don't know how to commission a sculpture. Like a church, let's say they want to put up a sculpture. Well, what do you do? How do you find a sculptor? How much do these things cost? Like, what are they even made of? Like people just don't know.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to put forth some resources that people can use to do that. Some of it will be, how is a sculpture made? I have been doing this talk where I do a slideshow and just showing people how do you get from an idea to a full bronze sculpture. It's a mystery to most people.
Yeah.
And I think that would be useful for people commissioning sculptures, people considering that, curious people, and a lot of people are homeschooling. So it could be a nice addition to an arts curriculum.
Great.
Honestly, like nobody knows how this happens. It's like total mystery. Even though there's a, step 1, 2, 3, there's a fabrication process and all of that. Some of it will be more contemplative. I like to consider myself a mystic a little bit, and having contemplative practices. Even though I think most people, when they meet me, I'm bubbly and fun and I like to do things and talk really fast, but I also have a lot of time alone where I think about things. And
secret introvert.
Secret introvert, yes. So I'm a extreme both and, but if I am too much around people, I will hide for days. And then I get sad and lonely, and then I want to see somebody, and I'm so happy to see people, like so genuinely happy to see people.
Yeah. Well, this has been great to see you and great to talk. Thanks.
Yeah, likewise, Sam. It's fun to have good conversation with you. I hope that we can do it again.
Thanks for listening to Living from the Soul. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, subscribe, and review. This is an ad-free podcast brought to you by my books, which are available at samtarode.com. The theme music was created by Gideon Tarode.